Hey everybody, how's it going today? Today we're going to be talking about the Resident Evil 1996 game and the 2002 remaster that they did for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. I haven't been a fan of Resident Evil's franchise for very long. I got into it back in 2020 when my girlfriend bought me Resident Evil 7 as a Christmas gift, and I absolutely loved it. I have played all of the other games since, and I'm absolutely in love with this franchise. I decided today to go back and talk about the original game because the first game has so much history behind it, and I found it all to be so interesting. And honestly, I play this game on stream all the time, and this game still has such a huge following still. I figured that today I would talk about it, and I could play it again so I could satisfy that itch, or the itchy tasty as many Resident Evil fans would say. I'm going to use a mix of original game footage and footage from the 2002 remake for this video, so I'm just putting that out there now. Let's get into the background information on this game before we get into the history and development. Oh, and real quick, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and comment what your thoughts are down below. I love reading everybody's thoughts, and I can't wait to see what people say about this game. But yeah, let's get into it. Resident Evil is a survival horror game that was created in 1996. This game was originally inspired by another game called Sweet Home, which was an NES game from 1989. This was actually another game that was made by Capcom. Sweet Home itself was a game that was based off of a movie by the same name. It was a Japanese movie, so it's something that wasn't very popular in America. But eventually it became its own title because Capcom had lost the license for Sweet Home, and the developers had realized that they would be able to do things with this game that they were not able to do with Sweet Home, and that was to add horror to it. Resident Evil actually kept a lot of Sweet Home's gameplay. A lot of these key features were the inventory system, the inventory management, the mansion setting, the puzzles, the emphasis on survival, the loading screens, the use of diary entries for storytelling. They also used lockpicks as an essential item and restored health from scattered items. And the death animations were from, something that they used inspiration from. They drew a lot of inspiration from Sweet Home, and it basically built Resident Evil into the game that it turned into. The limited ammo design was actually inspired from a game called Alcazar: The Forgotten Fortress. This feature would become a staple in the Resident Evil franchise for years to come. The production for this game started in 1993, and it took 3 years to develop. Within the first 6 months of development, Mikami, the lead designer, would spend all of his time working alone on the game. He would create sketches, he would create characters, and he would write over 40 pages of script. The project was originally planned for the release on the Super Nintendo before being pushed back so it could be developed on the PlayStation in 1994. Several of the backdrops for Resident Evil were inspired by the Overlook Hotel, which is the hotel in Colorado that was used for the setting of the 1980 movie The Shining. The developers wanted to lean more into Japanese psychological horror, but later they would decide to stick with American zombie influences of George A. Romero. Mikami had discovered the game Alone in the Dark that was created by Frederick Nainal, and this game gave Mikami the idea to adopt a more fixed camera view system, which would be featured prominently in the next 4 Resident Evil titles, and which many of the classic fans still love this game for. Mikami would be very reluctant to use the fixed camera angle style because he felt like it killed the player's immersion, but later he decided to use it because the pre-rendered backdrops allowed for a higher quality with the fixed camera angles, and it made the environment look better than his original 3D first-person prototype did. And his prototype did not work very well with the specs of the original PlayStation. This first-person perspective would not be used as a main gameplay design until Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. They actually had the idea to add co-op to the game, but this was eventually removed because according to Mikami, it was not good enough. They made this decision to remove it, and I wholeheartedly agree with this because I feel like if they had added co-op, it would remove the vibe of the game. When I play, I feel isolated and scared. With co-op, I feel like that would ruin this feeling entirely. Early footage of co-op was actually shown in 1995, but at this stage of development, local co-op was available in the game. They had shown this at a Jump v Japan show where it showed real-time weapon changes and a co-op mode, and they removed rudimentary character models and textures so that they could add this in. An early preview was shown in Maximum Console magazine, and it showed different final bosses and the graveyard that would eventually be shown in the 2002 remaster. Another thing that was featured in the game until late into the development was a guest house in a tower. This was eventually replaced by labs in a guardhouse. The real-time weapon changes obviously were removed from the final product of the game. Capcom had decided not to use motion capture for the original game, and they had conceived of another character named Dewey, who was to be an African-American character who was supposed to serve as the comic relief, and another character named Geyser, who was supposed to be a strongman character, but both of these ideas never led to anything, and they never ended up even making it to the final product. All of the development for the game was done on Silicon Graphics hardware, and the software program was SoftImage. The PlayStation was chosen to be the lead platform for development because the team felt that it was the most appropriate console for the game. Also, it probably helped that Sony is a Japanese company, but mainly because of the amount of polygon shapes that were used for the games when a lot of the consoles back then couldn't do more than 2D imagery. I remember talking to a lot of the fans from the original game, and even they said that the polygon shapes that were used in the game was groundbreaking for a game back then. The game, at the end of its development, had around 80 people working on the project, which is a lot for a game that was created in 1996. They had a full motion picture movie that was filmed in Japan with American actors that was never released because Mikami thought the acting was terrible. And it didn't portray the characters the way that Mikami thought that would be appropriate for the game. Clips would be used for the original game, but it was removed for the 2002 remake. George Romero was actually hired to write and direct a Resident Evil film adaptation in 1998, but he was later fired for producing a script that was not good enough. I don't know, I just thought that was kind of funny. Capcom expected that the game wouldn't sell more than 200,000 copies, but eventually they were blown away by the millions of copies that the game would go on to sell. Resident Evil is probably the most successful game franchise that Capcom has ever had in their catalog. To this day, the game continues to sell very well and still gets a lot of hype surrounding it, which is absolutely incredible for a game franchise that started off so small. This brings me back to the next section of the video where I'm going to talk about the story. I love this game so much, and I'm only going to go briefly into the story because it's kind of hard to explain the whole thing without turning this video into a walkthrough, but I will go over all of the key moments relating to the story. So, the game starts on July 24th, 1998, when a bizarre string of murders occurs on the outskirts of Raccoon City, a fictional town in Midwestern USA. Raccoon City's Special Police Task Force, known as STARS, are sent to investigate the Spencer Mansion after contact with Bravo Team is lost. Alpha Team is sent in to discover or find out what happened to them. This team consists of Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Chris Redfield, and Albert Wesker. Once they land, they are chased by dogs and they're forced to run into the Spencer Mansion. In the chaos, depending on who you play as, either Chris or Jill will go missing. For the sake of the video, I'm going to talk about Jill's story, because both her and Chris's story are slightly similar, minus a few things that happen. So, when the cutscene ends, you end up with Albert Wesker and Barry Burton. And you end up confused because Chris didn't make it, and you don't know where Chris is. So, the team decides to split up and cover the house in individual parts. Barry and Jill decide to head into the dining room, and this is where Barry discovers blood and starts to investigate it for some reason, like it's gonna tell him what happened. Meanwhile, Jill leaves through the door that's in the side of the dining room and discovers one of Bravo Team getting eaten by a zombie. This is when Jill runs back to Barry, who shoots the zombie, killing it. Through investigating, you find out that the house belongs to the Umbrella Corporation, who were experimenting with a virus that created these zombie creatures. These zombies are now roaming the mansion after being infected by the T-virus. Once collecting all the items and meeting various members of Bravo Team, as they are all killed off except for Rebecca Chambers, yes, I got it right this time, you are then sent to explore the mansion, and you have to find a lot of keys to open a lot of doors that are locked, but along the way, you see a lot of Bravo Team who are dead and alive, and you run into Barry again, who gives you a grenade launcher. But for Bravo Team, you run into Ricardo, who has been bitten by a snake, and you can actually save him if you make it back to him in time with serum. So that's kind of cool. And then you almost get squished in a trapped room where the ceiling comes down, but Barry is then able to save you at the last minute. I'm leaving out a lot of details because it doesn't really make up the plot as much as it does a walkthrough, and I'm just trying to stick to the story and keep it very light and very brief. You end up exploring various places like a backyard crypt, a courtyard, a swimming pool that empties into a walkway. You can actually go underground into what looks like another laboratory that's different than the one that you end up going to at the end of the game, where there's a shark that attacks you. But you also end up in a guest house that has a mutant plant called Plant 42, and that is a boss fight that you end up having to fight. But you can actually weaken Plant 42 if you make the right mixture of chemicals. So that's kind of like a cool simple way to defeat the boss. But eventually you'll end up in underground tunnels where you run into Enrico, who reveals that Alpha Team is a traitor before getting murdered in front of you, and then you fight a giant spider after that. So there's just a lot of bosses and a lot of cool things in this story. So after you collect all the items and solve all of the puzzles, you wind up finding an underground lab, and this is where we get to the finale of the game. There are multiple different endings that you can get, but the main ending in Resident Evil 1996 is that you unlock all the rooms and then you're confronted by Wesker, who was indeed the traitor the whole time, and he is working with Umbrella. He has Barry's family held captive, so he turned Barry into his unwilling accomplice, and forced Barry to help Wesker kill the Stars. So at this point, Barry will hold his gun to your head, and after listening to Wesker talk about the bioweapons that he is using Barry by threatening to kill his family, he plans to show you the Tyrant. Barry will leave and then come back and knock Wesker out cold. You then go into the lab and see the Tyrant. Barry walks up to the Tyrant and sees it in all its glory. He pushes on the keys on the panel, but accidentally frees the Tyrant instead of destroying it, and the Tyrant attacks Barry. Now it's up to the player, or Jill, to stop it. So you end up running around for a bit, and then you shoot and kill the Tyrant, or you seemingly kill the Tyrant. The ending is actually different in the remake, where instead of Barry unleashing the Tyrant, it's Wesker who unleashes the Tyrant. And when he does this, it's still the same setup where Wesker has Barry's family, but this time Barry will shoot Wesker, and then Wesker will go and activate the Tyrant's pod, which will then unleash the Tyrant. And when the Tyrant steps out this time, the Tyrant actually smacks Wesker and knocks him out. So it's a huge change. It's one of the many changes that are in the remake, but I just wanted to address that real quickly. So after you defeat the Tyrant, you run out of the lab with Barry because you have to go save Chris, and saving Chris is optional, but to get the good ending, you have to save Chris. You guys will then head to the roof so you can use flares to have Brad come and pick you guys up in the helicopter. Once the flares are shot, the Tyrant breaks through the ground, and this is where you have to fight the Tyrant again in his second form. You quickly dispose of the Tyrant, and then the helicopter comes and picks everybody up, and you make a clean escape as the mansion explodes. There are several different endings for this game depending on how you play and what character you play as. The best ending has you saving your partner. For Chris, it's Rebecca, and for Jill, it's Barry. If at least the partner survives, then the mansion will blow up and you escape. And if your partner dies, the mansion will stay intact and the tyrant is left to wander the forest. That's just a creepy thought, having that ugly bastard left to wander the woods just for some hiker to get ripped apart. But that was my brief explanation of the story. I've already talked a little bit about the release, but we'll talk about the release and the 2002 remake. And then I'll end the video off with a why you should play in 2024 and my final thoughts. So this game finally released in Japan on March 31st, 1996, after it was released in America on April 1st, 1996, and then after that it was released in the rest of Europe for August 16th, 1996. This game had massive success. It sold millions of copies worldwide. The game would then be ported multiple different times to multiple different ports, like Game Boy Color, Sega Saturn. You can actually get the director's cut, which was released because of the delay of Resident Evil 2, but you can actually get the director's cut on PlayStation Plus right now. So it's kind of fun to go back and play what the old game was like. This version of the game changed the location of nearly every vital item in the mansion, as well as enemy placement. The main characters actually got a wardrobe update, especially Rebecca. The player's handgun was replaced by an improved model where any shot fired has a random chance of instantly killing a zombie. This game would go on to become the best-selling game on PlayStation at the time of its release, with 1.16 million copies sold by the end of 1996. By December 1997, the game had sold over 4.6 million copies and grossed over $200 million. Which is $349 million by 2023's currency standards. The director's cut would go on to sell an additional 2.3 million, and Resident Evil would be dubbed the first survival horror game in the retro game franchises. For many gamers, Resident Evil would become their top 100th game, and I know it's mine for sure. I based most of my streaming content on Resident Evil, and its zombie influences actually helped me come up with my channel name, Mr. Deadox. In 2024, Resident Evil was inducted into the Video Game Hall of Fame. So this game has reached so many crazy milestones, and that's what makes this franchise so amazing. Next, I want to briefly mention the 2002 remake of Resident Evil, which for me was the one I played originally before playing the director's cut. So let's get into that. So the 2002 remake was originally released on the GameCube as part of a exclusivity deal between Capcom and Nintendo. This would continue for another 3 games after that. But in 2015, this remaster would finally be remade and released on the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and the Wii, before being released again on the Switch in 2019. With a limited edition being released for Japan on the PlayStation 3. This game would win a ton of accolades on its own. The production for this game began in 2001. The team wanted to make sure that the people who played the original game in 1996 could still enjoy the game in 2002. So they added a ton of cut content that was supposed to be in the original game, like the Lisa storyline with Umbrella, using Lisa and her mother in painful T-virus experiments. This would add a lot to the story that people had already known through all the diaries that could be picked up throughout the mansion, but this just added more for people to digest. Another piece of content that was added was the guardhouse in the cemetery. That was planned for the original game, but it had to be cut last minute for the sake of the story. They also increased the inventory space so that the lockpick having its own spot, defense items would also get their own spot instead of taking up inventory space. Enemies would be rebalanced to accommodate this, but they would change the difficulty levels from adjectives to full sentences to describe what kind of playthrough you were looking to play. They did this to attract the veteran players so they would come back and buy the remake, and a lot of veteran players found this to be the best remake they have ever done at the time. In addition to all of the design changes they implemented, they also decided to use motion capture to design the characters for this game. Capcom had sent out a casting call for most of the actors. The faces of the protagonists were based on the faces of real people, and their bodies were designed after the fact. Motion capture would be used to animate the models, and 60% of the captured data would be used for the design of the characters, and the rest would be done by scratch. The game was developed for over a year and 2 months, and the final development phase took 2 months, with the team working every day, all day, with no days off to make each of the deadlines. This would lead to the game being released on March 22, 2002 in Japan and April 30th, 2002 in North America. This game was considered to be one of the most visually appealing games in the whole franchise. That was until Resident Evil 7, 8, and all of the remakes that were done in 2018 through 2023. This game still continues to leave such a huge legacy for the franchise, and I hope that they decide to go back and give the game the remake treatment of the other games with a third person over the shoulder. Even though this game doesn't really need it because this game still holds up really well in 2024, it would still be nice to see a remake of this with, a nice coat of paint, as I normally say. But we'll talk about how this game holds up later in the video. Next, I want to talk about how many gamers feel about Resident Evil 1. I actually reached out to a ton of Resident Evil fans to get research for this, so I'm just going to give you exactly what these fans told me. So when I reached out to a lot of fans, a lot of people told me that they absolutely loved the fixed camera angles, which this can be very intimidating to people who are trying to play the game for the first time. But once you get used to it, it adds such a fun and spooky vibe to the game. And honestly, it makes you want to replay the game over and over again. This was something that really turned me away from the game when I had tried to play when I was younger, but my girlfriend bought me Resident Evil 7 and I went back and played all of the older games and gave it a chance. This made me love the franchise even more. I wish that the consoles would allow mod support because I would use mods to play with the fixed camera style on all of the new games. People really like these angles because it gave you a nice cinematic view of the game that most games did not have. The next thing that people loved were the tank controls, which again was something that turned me off until I got used to them. The remake also gave you the option to run using the joystick, so eventually it became easier to play. The tank controls add a sense of difficulty to navigating through the zombies and the map design. This is something that absolutely would define the franchise and would continue until Resident Evil 4. The third thing that people loved about this game were the puzzles. They were very creative and engaging, and was something that could be solved with common sense and good attention to detail. And I think that's great, especially because most games have these puzzles, and you need to watch YouTube videos just to follow and figure out how to solve them. And the fact that this game came out before modern age technology, or at least the modern age internet, just shows that they knew what kind of audience that they were trying to reach with this game. And these puzzles would be a staple in the franchise, even in the modern Resident Evil games that they have released. Resident Evil 5 took a backseat to these puzzles, and Resident Evil 6 didn't have any at all, that I can remember at least, but Resident Evil 7 and 8 brought them back in such a fun way, and it's good to know that even in today, these games can still have the fun puzzles that built the franchise. Another thing that was loved was the map design and the atmosphere of the game. The game does such a good job in making you feel isolated and alone, not only by leaving you to your own devices to try to solve the mystery behind the Spencer Mansion, but also limiting the amount of contact that you have with the other protagonists like Barry and Wesker. The map design also made it very replayable, because it would change what strategy you used and how fast you could get to each item. In a way, the more you played, the more you would find easier and better ways to do some of the puzzles, and a lot of this has to do with a perfect mix of level design, controls, and fixed camera angles. A lot of fans wish that the mansion was bigger with more places to explore and things to see, but because of the limitations of technology, this would have been hard for a game that was made for the PlayStation 1. That's probably why it took them until the remake to add some of the extra cut content from the original. The next and the most important piece to this was the story. This is important because the story is what would eventually start the snowball for the rest of the franchise, with the eventual outbreak in Raccoon City and the rest of the various outbreaks in the other games. Without this story from this game, none of the other games would have been possible, and for the original game to have such an interesting story and have it be such an old game where story back then was not as important as long as the game was fun. Nowadays, the story is the most important piece to a lot of the games, and for this to have this and have such an amazing story with amazing characters just adds to why this game is so integral for many games that followed afterwards. If not for the success of Resident Evil, we probably wouldn't have seen games like Dead Rising or any of the other major Capcom properties that they took a risk on. Now, the one criticism that I have, and this is something that was brought to light through an award ceremony, but the only thing I haven't mentioned was the god-awful dialogue in the 1996 version of the game. The dialogue was so bad that it actually got nominated for the worst dialogue in the video game, which I agree with 100%. I mean, the only funny thing that came out of the original game was the Jill Sandwich meme, but even that made fans question their existence in life. Seriously though, what are we? Why are we here? Anyways, that's going to conclude that portion of the video. Next, we're going to talk about why you should play this game in 2024, and then my final thoughts on the game before we wrap up. So now the big question is why you should play this in 2024, or should you play this in 2024? And of course you should play this game in 2024. This game is what started it all. This game single-handedly built a franchise with hard work and just creating the idea that players should feel scared, and it paid off. Many people might feel intimidated by the tank controls or the fixed camera angles, but please give it a chance, and I promise that you will always remember this game as still being one of those games that you play every Halloween. I know I play it every Halloween. I will go back and play this game because it scratches that horror itch that many games nowadays don't do a very good job with. And I would say that this game is more fun and scarier than most of the games that are on the modern horror game market. And for this game being from 1996 or 2002, depending on which one you decide to play, many modern games today rely on cheap jump scares and gimmicks to scare you. And that's not the case with this game. This game makes you feel scared because of the sense of isolation you have when you play. And the story is also very creepy, and anytime you read the diaries that explain the T-Virus, it makes you glad that the T-Virus isn't a real thing. I mean, even the Tyrant is scary, and this is before we meet our friend Mr. X in Resident Evil 2.
This. Just get me the fuck out of here! X gon' give it to you. Fuck, wait for you to get it on your own. X gon' deliver to you. Knock, knock, open.
All jokes aside, I really hope that the people who haven't played this game really give it a shot because you will not regret it. It's so much fun. But let's get into my final. So as huge as of a Resident Evil fan that I am, I wouldn't have gotten into these games if it wasn't for my girlfriend. And I'm glad that she got me into this franchise because it has created unforgettable memories for me. I would have never have touched this franchise if not for her. This game deserves a remake even though it doesn't need it, because I would like to see what they could do with a nice coat of paint and a few modern touch-ups. This definitely shouldn't be the next remake. I think Code Veronica deserves it way more, but I really hope that Capcom is at least considering giving this game some kind of 30th anniversary remake, because this is where the whole franchise started, and like I said before, is the reason why so many other games were made after this. If not for Resident Evil, we probably wouldn't have gotten Dead Rising or any of the other franchises that Capcom took a gamble on, and it paid off. This game just does such an amazing job blending the isolation with the horror, and that's something that, if it were made today, probably wouldn't be done right. This game was just a mix of the right company, the right developers, the right technology, and thank God they made it when they did. Because we wouldn't have all of these amazing games today if it wasn't for Shinji Mikami and his determination to make an unforgettable experience. This game not only created a new genre of games, but completely revolutionized the gaming industry with such a simple but complex concept. And it just amazes me with how much work went into this game, and all the different inspirations that this game drew from other games at the time. As I'm doing research, I learned so much more about this franchise that I didn't know before going into this video. But that's gonna do it. If you learned something new, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And also comment what your thoughts are on this game down below. Also, if you enjoyed this, please go watch another video, because that's how the algorithm works, and if you enjoyed this, maybe it'll recommend it to somebody else who does too. I want to thank everybody again for watching, and have a good night.